My name is Nidhi Krishnan, and I just finished up my first year at WashU. In the past few months, we've seen that both Asian and Black Americans have been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus. Hate crimes against Asian Americans have skyrocketed, exposing the deeply rooted xenophobic tendencies that are present in the American public. But at the same time, Asian Americans are definitely not the only victims of the coronavirus, as Black Americans are disproportionately dying from the disease. But even though both Asian and Black Americans are uniquely and adversely impacted by the coronavirus, these two groups are often pitted against each other in mainstream discourse. And a lot of this tension stems from the weaponization of the model minority stereotype. The model minority stereotype is the portrayal of Asian Americans as naturally smart, hardworking, and successful. For example, when Andrew Yang jokes that he knows a lot of doctors because he's Asian, that's a perfect example of the model minority stereotype in effect. And although Andrew Yang's comments may not initially seem to cause any harm, they reinforce a narrative that has been used against Black Americans for decades. In studying the weaponization of the model minority stereotype, I conducted an original research survey in which I asked respondents to describe their general feelings towards Asian Americans. An anonymous respondent said, and I'm quoting, I tend to think of Asian Americans in comparison to myself and my ethnic background. Asian Americans are a, in quotes, good minority. I am a, in quotes, bad minority. And I thought that this sentiment really effectively demonstrated the weaponization of the model minority stereotype, which has been present since its inception. The term was first coined in 1966 by William Peterson, when he wrote an article in which he applauded Japanese Americans for succeeding in the face of xenophobia, while in turn shaming Black Americans for their relative economic disadvantage. The general sentiment was that Japanese Americans had pulled themselves up by the bootstraps by being a model minority, and that Black Americans were struggling not because of systemic injustice, but due to bad behavioral choices. And although this essay was written decades ago, the weaponization of the model minority stereotype is still incredibly potent today, especially in public discourse surrounding affirmative action, where Asian Americans are used as mere props to advance the anti-affirmative action agenda. Edward Bloom, the white leader of the anti-affirmative action lobby, had spent his lifetime fighting against the policy, when in the early 2010s, he started to zero in on Asian Americans to recruit them as plaintiffs to serve in his lawsuits against universities. But as time went on, Asian Americans became a prominent figure and face of the anti-affirmative action movement. But in reality, this depiction could not be more distanced from the actual reality of Asian Americans, as the majority of the Asian American community actually supports affirmative action. In 2006, when Michigan voters voted on an anti-affirmative action ballot proposition, 75% of Asian American voters voted against the proposition and in support of affirmative action. But even though the vast majority of Asian Americans actually support affirmative action, the white-led lobby has used the Asian American identity as a pawn to advance their agenda. And they rely on the weaponization of the model minority stereotype to construct their narrative. The premise of their argument is that Asian Americans were able to succeed in the face of adversity without extra support. So why can't Black Americans do the same through race-blind policies? But this weaponization of the model minority stereotype ignores two key considerations. First, high-achieving Asian American subgroups are not inherently or behaviorally any smarter or more hardworking than Black Americans. Rather, the Asian Americans who were allowed to immigrate to the U.S. were often the ones with special skills and education, due to our country's merit-based immigration policies that took effect in 1965. But moreover, even though both Asian and Black Americans have both experienced racism, one cannot begin to compare or equate the two experiences. Don't get me wrong, as an Asian American who grew up in a predominantly white town, I'm fully aware that discrimination against Asian Americans is a very real threat to equity. However, when looking at the bigger picture, discrimination towards Asian Americans has been less institutionalized and overall less severe. So the weaponization of the model minority stereotype relies on this faulty comparison. And it's important to keep these considerations in mind because they help to debunk the model minority myth and combat its anti-Black implications. What we often forget in the midst of things is that the civil rights movement actually helped Asian Americans. It paved the way for the 1965 immigration reforms that allowed more immigrants into this country. And personally, as a first-generation American, I'm able to grow up in this country because of the civil rights movement. As Asian Americans, we must refuse to be a wedge group used to undermine support for needed reparative policies. And we can do that by refusing to be complicit in the weaponization of the model minority stereotype, and instead striving for greater solidarity with the Black community.